Hey everyone, Nigel and Luke here, and welcome to part 2 of our series of videos focusing on people who were wrongfully convicted for crimes committed by serial killers. If you haven't seen part 1, be sure to check that out first. We'll leave a link in the description below. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this. It really helps us to continue building the channel. With that out of the way, here is part 2 of 3 more people wrongfully convicted for the crimes of serial killers.
On January 25, 1984, the secretary of 32-year-old Washington lawyer Carolyn Jean Hamm was starting to grow concerned. Her boss had been absent for work for 2 days without making contact, something that was completely out of character for her given the demanding nature of her work. Worried that something was wrong, she decided to contact Carolyn's best friend, Darla Henry, to see if she had any news, or was able to check in on her. Darla agreed, but wasn't initially all that concerned. She had just seen Carolyn 2 days earlier and knew that she had plans to fly out to Peru that weekend. She thought that maybe she was just taking care of some last-minute tasks before her trip. However, when Darla arrived at Carolyn's house in Arlington, Virginia, she soon realized that something was seriously wrong. Carolyn's car was still on the driveway, and her front door had been left slightly open. Disturbed by what she had found, Darla requested the help of one of the neighbors, a young man named Larry Rancer, to help her investigate. In the basement of the home, the pair made a shocking discovery: Carolyn's nude, lifeless body. Her hands had been bound behind her back, and she had been sexually assaulted. She had died from being hung with a Venetian blind cord, and after her death had been cut down and left on the floor. A nearby window was also discovered open, and it appeared as though some items may have been missing from the house. Initially, police turned their attention to Larry Rancer, the young neighbor who had helped Darla Henry uncover the crime scene. Rancer was interviewed, but when they requested hair and blood samples, his sister coincidentally called telling police she had information about the murder. She told investigators that she was friends with Carolyn, and that prior to her death, she had complained about a creepy man in the neighborhood who had supposedly spied on her while she was sunbathing. She said she had spotted the man in the neighborhood on January 23rd, the last day Carolyn was seen alive. Then, another neighbor named Michael Ansari called in with a tip about the same man, saying that he had seen him in the area on the day that Carolyn's body was discovered. The man's name was David Vasquez, a 38-year-old former janitor at a local Arlington high school. It looked like police had zeroed in on a credible suspect. Despite the 2 eyewitness accounts, there were obvious reasons to doubt David's involvement in the crime for anyone willing to look. For starters, though he had at one point lived in Arlington, David had moved 30 miles away to Manassas several months prior to the murder. He was also considered to have serious intellectual impairments and had been assessed as having an IQ below 70. David lived with his mother, and neither of them drove. Still, based on the 2 eyewitnesses, police were sure that they had found their perpetrator. In early February, police picked up David from the local fast food restaurant where he worked and took him in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the crime and said that he had been home in Manassas on the day it took place. He also insisted that he had not made any recent trips to Arlington, as he could not drive. He continued to plead his innocence until police told him that they had recovered his fingerprints from the scene. Though this was completely made up by the interrogating officers, it caused David to change his story. Lacking the mental capabilities to defend himself and eager to please the authorities, he began to parrot the investigators' information back to them and claimed that it was possible that he had gone to Carolyn Hamm's house for a visit on the day of her murder. Throughout the interview, he got information wrong about the case, repeating information back to his interrogators as he was constantly corrected about details such as the murder weapon and manner of Carolyn's death. Still, police considered it a confession. A couple of days later, David was brought in a second time after they realized that they'd forgotten to advise him on his Miranda rights. Again, he began by denying any involvement in the crime. However, sometime into that second interview, David admitted to investigators that he had had horrible dreams and proceeded to recount a situation in which he had slept with a woman and then strangled her to death. Police again took this as a sign of his guilt and charged him with murder, rape, and burglary. David was interviewed one final time by police, and this time they got him to sign a document waiving his Miranda rights before recording another account of his dream. When David finally received legal counsel, they attempted to get all 3 of the statements to police suppressed on the grounds that they had not been voluntary. A judge agreed to suppress the first 2 statements, but allowed the third because of the document David signed waiving his Miranda rights. As police further investigated the case, it was also discovered that not even the physical evidence in the case showed any clear sign of David's involvement. Semen evidence recovered from the scene was not a match to his blood type, and footprints found on Carolyn Hamm's house were not a match to any of the shoes that he owned. Still, prosecutors decided to move ahead with charges against David, insisting that all this suggested was that he must have had a co-conspirator. Despite the state's seemingly weak case, when they offered David a plea deal, his lawyers told him he should seriously consider it. They were concerned that the tape in which he had described his disturbing dream would be enough to convince a jury, and that he was likely to receive the death penalty if convicted. As a result, in February of 1985, David entered an offered plea, essentially allowing him to assert his innocence, but acknowledging that the evidence against him would be enough to persuade a judge or jury of his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison. For a while, this seemed like the conclusion of the case, until another horrifying crime was committed 2 years later. On December 1st, 1987, the body of 44-year-old Susan Tucker was found in her apartment in Arlington. Like Carolyn Hamm, she had been raped and strangled to death after her home had been broken into. Of particular interest was the fact that she had been strangled with a thin nylon cord similar to the Venetian blind cord that Carolyn Hamm had been killed with. In the aftermath of Susan's murder, the detective assigned to the case, Joe Horgus, started to become concerned that a killer was on the loose. As he investigated deeper, he discovered an eerie similarity not only between the two cases in Arlington, but to a string of unsolved sexual assaults and murders in the south side of the city of Richmond. In each case, the female victim had been bound, sexually assaulted, and strangled with a thin cord. The perpetrator had been dubbed the Southside Strangler. All of the crimes had happened while David was in prison. In addition, Horgus learned that between 1983 and 1984, at least 10 women in Arlington and Alexandria had survived sexual assaults committed by a perpetrator that they described as a thin black man armed with a knife and a thin cord. To explain the 3-year gap between the crimes, Horgus theorized that the perpetrator might have been in prison between 1984 and 1987, and began to look through records that matched the criteria he was looking for. Eventually, he came across a man named Timothy Spencer. Spencer had been arrested at the end of January in 1984 for a burglary in Alexandria, just days after the murder of Carolyn Hamm. He had been released from prison in September of 1987, right before the murders of 3 women in Richmond and the murder of Susan Tucker in Arlington. At the same time, DNA testing was just beginning to emerge as a tool in forensics, having recently been used in the UK to convict murderer Colin Pitchfork. Horgus believed that DNA testing might be the key to cracking the unsolved cases in Virginia. Though the perpetrator had been careful not to leave behind fingerprints, he had left behind semen at nearly all of his murder scenes. He reached out to one of the few laboratories that was doing DNA testing at the time, a company in New York called Life Codes that specialized in DNA paternity testing. When a DNA sample was collected from Timothy Spencer, testing revealed that it was a match to evidence found with the body of Susan Tucker, as well as 2 out of the 3 murders in Richmond. In 1988, Spencer was convicted of the rape, burglary, and murder of Susan Tucker. This was followed by convictions in 2 of the 3 Richmond cases, that of Debbie Davis and Dr. Susan Helms. He was eventually convicted of the 3rd Richmond murder, 15-year-old Diane Cho, even though testing in that case proved inconclusive. Timothy Spencer would become the first person in the U.S. sentenced to death based on DNA evidence. Despite the striking similarity of Carolyn Hamm's murder to those of Spencer's other victims, he was never charged with her murder. There are competing explanations to why this is the case, though all of them focus on problems with the DNA evidence. Sources say that there was either not enough DNA to test, or that the sample was too degraded by 1987 to be useful for testing. This meant that David Vasquez was left with no clear legal course of action under Virginia law to get his case thrown out. Thankfully, due to the overwhelming circumstantial evidence pointing to Timothy Spencer as the perpetrator in the Carolyn Hamm case, David was granted a pardon from the governor Gerald Baliles in January of 1989 and set free. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, David was awarded $117,000 in 1990 for the 4 years he spent in prison. Timothy Spencer was executed in the electric chair on April 27, 1994.
Do you know of any other cases like this that you think we should check out? Tell us about them in the comments section below. As always, if you enjoyed our video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. Thank you for watching.